It's September 1939. The Nazis have invaded Poland and essentially started World War II. The United States response? We're going to stay neutral. But that changes just a couple of years later. So what happened? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today's video is titled From Isolation to Involvement. We're going to do our best to answer the question, what led the U.S. to abandon isolationism and enter the war? And of course the war we're talking about here is World War II. So grab yourself a pencil and paper, get ready to take some notes. Hopefully by the end of the video you'll have a good answer for that question. To understand what really drew America into World War II, we have to jump over to Europe real quick and talk about the French and the British real fast. The first thing we need to talk about is a line of fortifications the French built after the Great War called collectively the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was really just a series of pretty big fortifications that were built along the French and German border. Basically, it's kind of like the Great Wall of China except between France and Germany. This was meant to be a deterrent for the Germans. If they were ever going to try to invade France again, like they did during the Great War, it would be impossible for them because there's no way they could get past this Maginot Line. Well, the Germans saw this and they had a pretty simple solution. They just went around. They invaded through an area of Europe known as the Ardennes Forest. You may ask yourself, where exactly is the Ardennes Forest? To answer that question, take a look at this map right here. The solid red line you see is basically where the French built their massive fortifications, right along the border of Germany and France. If you look at the little red dotted line that's on the border of Belgium and France, that's where the French had a lot weaker fortifications for the Maginot Line. Because the French, they thought there's no way the Germans would dare go through Belgium again in order to invade. So, to quickly answer the question, where is the Ardennes Forest? If you guessed Belgium, you'd be correct. The Germans basically did the exact same thing they did in the Great War. The Germans, though, they did things just a little bit differently this time. During this war, the Germans relied on a tactic known as the Blitzkrieg, or translated from German, it literally means lightning war. The Blitzkrieg is a style of attacking where you basically charge at your enemy as fast as you can using new modern mechanized things like tanks and trucks and stuff like that, and you attack as fast as you can for the specific purpose of breaking through your enemy's lines. Once you break through those enemy lines, you basically turn around and start attacking them from behind. This is a fantastic military strategy that the Germans more or less perfected. This is how they were able to get into Poland and take over Poland in a month. This is also how they were able to get into France so quickly and basically take care of France in just under 2 months. The British Army and the French Army essentially had no way of really dealing with this new style of Blitzkrieg warfare. Eventually what happened is the French Army and the British Army got themselves backed up against the English Channel in an area known as Dunkirk. It's right along kind of the French-Belgian border. The idea was the Germans were going to trap them there and basically wipe them out. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a goof up in the Germans' attack plan. This gave enough time for about 338,000 Great Britain troops to escape across the English Channel. Essentially, they used pretty much anything that could float to get themselves back home to England. Had this escape not happened, there's a good chance the German army would have wiped out Great Britain right then and there, and this war would have gone totally different. As I'd mentioned before, France fell quickly. It only took about a month and a half once Germany decided to invade. To add insult to injury, once the French decided they were going to surrender to Germany, Germany went and found the exact same railroad car that the French had used in the Great War to force the Germans to surrender. When it was all said and done, France was basically divided in two. There was a northern half and a southern half. The northern half became known as occupied France. It was basically totally controlled by the Germans, mostly because of the English Channel being right there and Great Britain being so close. The Germans had their sights set on Great Britain next. Southern France became known as what's called Vichy France. They were technically neutral throughout the rest of the war, but essentially they did whatever they were told to do by the Nazis. In the summer of 1940, Germany was getting ready to invade the British Isles. They were going to go after Great Britain. Hitler's plan was to kind of soften them up as much as he could with their air force. It's known as the Luftwaffe. Throughout that summer, Hitler sent wave after wave of bomber to Great Britain to essentially bomb them into submission. Unfortunately for Hitler, Great Britain fought back with some new technology known as the radar. Great Britain could basically see these planes coming and knew exactly where they were going to be. This gave them an opportunity to send up fighters to get them shot down. After a few months of this, Hitler basically got fed up and totally gave up on the plan, realized that he had some other things he had to deal with first. Mainly Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. In Hitler's mind, the only reason that the British couldn't be bombed into submission was because they were being fed information. And in Hitler's kind of weird, crazy, messed up brain, the only possible solution to this was that Joseph Stalin must be trying to play both sides, and Joseph Stalin must be the one that's giving the British the information. Now, that's totally untrue. The British were using radar, and that's why they knew exactly where the bombers were coming from and heading to. But Hitler decided instead he was going to go after the Soviet Union, decided to invade the Soviet Union. Turns out that might have been a big mistake. So let's check the timeline of where we're at. By the end of the summer of 1940, France has totally fallen to the Germans. Great Britain is just barely hanging on. So what's the United States doing? Because in the grand scheme of things, Great Britain and France, their best friend is the United States. What are we doing to help our buddy out? Well, if you remember, the Neutrality Acts in the mid-1930s said that we couldn't do anything for anybody that was at war. We had our own problems to solve. By the end of 1940, America was slowly starting to kind of change our minds. Congress does two things that make it possible for us to basically help our friends out. The first one was called the cash carry provision. This allowed the United States to sell war goods to any country they wanted to, as long as two things were met. Number one, the country had to pay cash up front for those goods. That way the United States, no matter what happens, doesn't lose any money. This is great for our economy. The second thing is the country that is buying the war goods is in charge of transporting the war goods. The United States isn't about to stick any of its ships and sailors out there on the ledge and possibly be shot out of the water by German U-boats. Again, remember, that's exactly what happened during the Great War. So as long as France and Great Britain could provide cash up front and could transport those goods, the United States said, no problem, we'll help you out, we'll sell you anything you need to try to fight the Germans. This goes on for a little while. By 1941, things have changed just a little bit. Congress passes this thing called the Lendlease Act. FDR had proposed that we should allow our friends to borrow what they need to fight this war, and anything that they couldn't return at the end of the war, they would go ahead and pay us back for it. Essentially what was happening is Great Britain was running out of cash to buy things from us, and they were also running out of ships to be able to transport stuff. So we needed to do something because they were the only country left in Europe that was really trying to fight the Nazis. In a speech about the Lend-Lease Act, FDR kind of compared this to lending your neighbor your garden hose if their house was on fire. He said it's the sensible thing to do. Yeah, it might make you look good because you're trying to be nice to help your neighbor out by giving him a way to put that fire out, But maybe more importantly, by you allowing your neighbor to get that fire out, it reduces the risk that that fire is going to spread to your house. Where do you think Germany's next objective was once Hitler controlled all of Europe? FDR knew that it was only a matter of time before Hitler set his sights on the United States. So as you can see, by 1940, the United States is starting to get involved in this war. But we're not at war yet. That doesn't happen until December 7th, 1941. It's become known as the day which will live in infamy. That is the day that Japan conducted a sneak attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And in that sneak attack, they more or less wiped out our entire Navy. Take a look at these two pictures real quick. They kind of outline exactly what happened at Pearl Harbor when we were attacked by Japan. Japan conducted 2 attack runs. The first one was at 7:55 in the morning. December 7th, 1941 happened to be a Sunday morning. The Japanese knew that America generally saved Sunday morning for resting and relaxation. That would have been the perfect time to attack. When they came in on their first attack run, their main objectives were to take out any airplanes that were on the island of Oahu. They hit Wheeler Air Force Base, and then they also hit a naval air station, and then they went after the actual fleet in the harbor. They did some pretty good damage, but the main objective in that first run was to take out our aircraft and to cause as much confusion as they possibly could. An hour later, a second flight of enemy aircraft came in, and that flight was the flight that more or less finished off the Navy. If you look at the second picture, you can see how much damage they wound up inflicting to all the ships that we had basically parked in the harbor. The Japanese caused a massive amount of damage to our naval forces. In total, that attack on Pearl Harbor cost the United States 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 160 aircraft, and almost 2,500 Americans died. Not all of those Americans were servicemen. There were also a lot of casualties inflicted on civilians that were in and around the naval base in Pearl Harbor as well. This has become the single most deadly attack by a foreign country on American soil. You may ask why. Why did Japan decide to attack us? Japan viewed the U.S. presence in Asia as a threat. Remember that we had Hawaii, that was a territory of the United States. We also had the Philippines, another territory of the United States. And the United States also had a lot of trade with other Asian countries. China was a huge trade partner. The Japanese kind of viewed this as threatening their ability to create their own empire. The relationship that Japan had with the United States was kind of on a decline too. Throughout the 1930s, the United States continually put embargoes on Japan as Japan tried to be more militaristic and expand. An embargo is basically where you refuse to sell stuff to a given country for a specific reason. In this case, one of the big things was oil. The United States supplied Japan with about 80% of its oil. When Japan started to try to create this massive Asian empire, the US basically cut them off. And Japan said, we need to find another way to get ourselves some oil. If we get the United States out of the picture, we can find other supplies of oil to use. You may think that December 7th, 1941 is the day the United States entered World War II. That's not entirely true. It was actually December 8th, the very next day. After things kind of settled down and reports were all put in, FDR sat down and crafted a very convincing speech that he gave to Congress on December 8th. In that speech, he basically outlines what happened and how the United States, in his opinion, should react. In that speech, he says that December 7th, 1941 is a day which will live in infamy. This is something that historians will remember forever because of the sneakiness which Japan conducted itself with. At the end of the speech, FDR urges Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. They attacked us, it's only right that we attack them back. And immediately Congress responded with an overwhelming yes. That's when the United States officially enters this war, when we declare war on Japan, December 8th, 1941. Just a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. That happened on December 11th, 1941. By then, the United States was totally drawn into World War II. Okay, so what do we need to take away from today's video? Number one, remember that France didn't stand really a chance against the Nazi Blitzkrieg. Number two, remember that Great Britain was able to stand up against the Nazis, but just barely. And that was mostly due to a thing called radar. And number three, probably the most important, remember the date December 7th, 1941. That was the date that Japan sucker punched the U.S. at Pearl Harbor and destroyed our Pacific Fleet. Ultimately, that's the thing that got us involved in World War II. Alright guys, hopefully you got great notes. Be ready for that quiz when it happens in class. And as always, till next time, remember, don't stop learning.